Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 443, Reigning Over Contempt, Part 3, How Righteousness Helps You Achieve Heart Regulation. The podcast objectives are speak to the urgency of reigning over contempt, analyze the difficulty in walking in the path of righteousness, and analyze the tests and trials situated at the end of each spiritual season. Now is the time to make it happen. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 274 of our exposition of lawlessness. Before I begin today's lesson, I believe it is fitting that I announce that this is the 200th podcast the Spirit has led me to create in this end time series. If you've been paying attention, then you realize we have only addressed 3 of the 16 primary degrees of holiness. Likewise, we have only addressed 3 of the 20 primary degrees of lawlessness. This is largely because we have invested a considerable amount of time analyzing the makeup of our minds and our hearts. And seeing as we have covered these leading facets of our souls, we can now focus our attention on the remaining degrees of holiness and lawlessness. And I promise you, we will pick up the pace. For time is of the essence, always of the essence. Not only this, but the sealing of the set apart ones is coming to an end, and our world will soon enter the time of the great distress. My dear friends, the sifting of the nations will soon begin, and these podcasts will be of no value to anyone who does not have the seal of Elohim. Therefore, I encourage you to make sure you stay on track with these lessons. And if you are not reigning over contempt, now is the time to make it happen. Now, that said, we should pick up where we left off in the most recent podcast. Vis-a-vis, we began analyzing how the primary illustrations of virtue help you achieve heart regulation. And we started with honesty, the fundamental degree of virtue and the conscience of your heart. From now, we must analyze the primary illustrations of righteousness and purification and the roles they play in creating a heart that is fixed to do the Father's will. And we will begin by analyzing the primary illustration of righteousness. It won't be much of a fight. Now, understanding how all the degrees of virtue are sequential, we should begin our analysis of the role of righteousness in fixing our hearts by restating the primary role and objective of honesty in the same procedure. Consider this, my friends, and remember. The primary objective of honesty is to cause us to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She does this by providing your heart with a conscience, i.e., a moral compass, which becomes the governor of your heart. My dear friends, Hear me carefully as I say, this is huge. Remember, your heart in its original state is desperately wicked. Remember, Yahushua Messiah told us that everything that defiles a man comes from the heart. But now, due to the work of honesty, your heart is no longer desperately wicked. Quite the contrary, your heart is committed to the direction and the cause of the greater good, and it is on the verge of being made pure. Now, this brings us to righteousness and the role he plays in regulating our hearts. Now that our hearts are being governed by the spirit of honesty. Along these lines, righteousness empowers us to always do what we know is right. No doubt, the first step in fulfilling this prime objective is knowing what is right. And thanks to the great work of honesty, this will never be an issue because you, my friend, have a conscience. You, my friend, have a moral compass to serve as your guiding light. Now, this brings us to step number 2. To wit, once you know the way that is right, you must walk in that path. The reason why is sure, and I will offer it as an inflection point. This is one I advise you to bookmark. As sojourners in the way of holiness, we do not have the luxury of walking a path that is free of pressures, tests, trials, aggression, assaults, and assails. Quite the contrary, the way of holiness is the most difficult and spiritually demanding path you can follow within the sphere of men. For look, listen, it has been written, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. The Torah and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of Elohim is announced as good news, and every man presses his way into it. Now, it may be contradictory to some to declare the way of holiness is the most secure path in every sphere of existence, and at the same time testify to the immense pressure and difficulty in traversing this narrow way. How do we account for it? To begin with, we must understand why the way of holiness is hard pressed. To wit, we must appreciate why the path into everlasting life is violent and filled with constant aggression. It is for the following reason, which I will offer as another inflection point. Consider this. The kingdom of darkness has been licensed to apply pressure to the way of holiness. And yet, this evil confederation cannot operate outside of the Father's prescribed bounds. Not only this, but seeing as every other path within the sphere of men falls into the spiritual jurisdiction of the kingdom of darkness, they are not wasting their efforts attempting to violate any other way. Quite the contrary, Satan and his cohorts are all investing their time and energies assaulting the way of holiness to see if they can deceive any of us into falling out of the way. My dear friends, you must believe me. This is one of the primary variations of our tests and trials. Vis-a-vis, many of our tests and trials are occasions of spiritual warfare. To wit, Yahuwah is calling us to go to battle on behalf of the kingdom of heaven. He is giving us an opportunity to demonstrate our masteries of all the lines and precepts of holiness, which we should have mastered by now. Here lies the inflection, the danger, and the problem. Alas, it is the most prominent reason why many are unsuccessful in spiritual warfare. And it is also why they will eventually fall out of the way of holiness. Consider this, my friends, and be advised. While the enemy is preparing himself for the next battle, he is distracting many within this nation from preparing themselves for the fight. Why? It's because he knows that the only way he can defeat us in spiritual warfare is if we are not prepared for the battle. And thus, knowing his only path to victory is this: Satan invests more time distracting you from preparing yourself for the next battle than he does in fighting the actual battle. For lo, if you are not prepared for any battle with the kingdom of darkness, it won't be much of a battle. You, my friend, will not only lose, trust me, it won't be much of a fight. The test at the end of each season. Now, if you recall, we have analyzed these matters in many podcasts, vis-a-vis and end times 392, reigning over disobedience and doubt, part 2, which was posted on December 23rd, 2024. I revealed the following inflection point, which I encourage you to bookmark and never forget. The outcome of every spiritual battle is determined prior to the battle, and you will only gain the victory if you make up your mind to comply. Not only this, but if you also recall, in End Times 385, your victory over complacency, part 2, which was posted on December 16th, 2024, we revealed that there is a time factor associated with the Father's will. Then, in End Times 390, the importance of reigning over disobedience, which was posted on December 18th, 2024, we analyze the importance of understanding and abiding by this time factor in spiritual warfare. Here is why this is so important. If you fail to gain the victory in any spiritual battle in accordance with the time factor of the Father's will, the next battle will be 7 times harder than the first. And trust me, if you cannot defeat the footmen, you have no chance at defeating the horsemen. Now, that being said, it should be crystal clear that Yahuwah expects us to make a certain amount of progress in our quest at the appointed time. Not only this, but his expectations are not limited to his desire for us to grow. Quite the contrary. My dear friends, Yahuwah's desire for our growth is contingent to the fact that it is required for us to succeed in spiritual warfare and to always be prepared for the next battle. And trust me, it doesn't matter where we are at in our quest for holiness. There will always be the next battle. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, spiritual battles are being fought every day. Ergo, the moment you gain any victory, you must appreciate how the next battle is already underway. Now, I'm not saying this to frighten anyone. And yet, for those of you who are not familiar with my background, let me tell you something. I'm a watchman. My commission is to warn the nation of clear and present danger. And one of the clearest and most present dangers in this nation is sure. The majority are being defeated in spiritual warfare because they are not prepared for the battle. And they are not prepared for the battle because they are not growing in accordance with the Father's will. That's the key, my friends. Vis-a-vis, we are not talking about some arbitrary, subjective model of growth. Quite the contrary. We are talking about an expected amount of spiritual growth and increase contingent to all the gifts and talents Yahuwah has afforded us. Here again, this growth is not only expected, it is also required for us to succeed in spiritual warfare. Here lies the inflection and the key. Consider the following points, my friends, and give the more earnest heed to spiritual mastery. The progress Yahuwah expects you to make in any given season of your spiritual life is required for you to succeed all the tests and trials in that season. Not only this, but it is required for you to pass the ultimate test at the end of each season. Here lies a revelation which Elohim has commanded me to share with his children. Receive it with all humility, my friends, and live. The same way that every line of holiness is mastered by a precept, to wit, a final exam encapsulating every associated test and trial. The conclusion of every spiritual season in your life is highlighted by a final exam encapsulating every test and trial you endured in that season. My dear friends, here lies the primary difference between the renewed nation of Israel and the dying nation of Israel. To wit, the former is making the transition from season to season because they are consistently prepared for the transition. On the other hand, the dying nation is not making the transition because they are like the man in the parable who was given 1 talent. Vis-a-vis, they are not making spiritual increase. Ergo, they will find themselves the biggest losers in spiritual warfare. Here lies the inflection and another revelation, to wit, the final exam you must pass at the end of every spiritual season in your life will always include some spiritual battle. Listen to me. The kingdom of darkness is standing in between you and the path to your destiny. Look here. The enemy has positioned himself to block you from following the path to obtain the seal of Elohim. Why? It's because he doesn't want you to be guarded during the great distress. Now, the question of the hour is, what are you going to do about it? If you're not exactly sure, allow me to tell you what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to make sure I am consistently engaged in effectual prayer, effectual fasting, and the most advanced form of spiritual focus. Believe it, that's the first thing I'm going to do, because I know that if I don't unlock the power of these 3 pillars, nothing else matters. I've already lost the next battle. Next, I'm going to remind myself that every path to victory over the kingdom of darkness is centered on always doing what I know is right. If you recall, this prime objective is the foundation of the primary illustration of righteousness. Enter the path of righteousness. Now, we analyze the legendary nature of the path of righteousness and its association with the way of holiness in End Times 426, an intro to righteousness, part 1, which was posted on March 3rd, 2025. If you have not already listened to this podcast, I advise you to do so whenever you find the time. Now, as it pertains to our victories in spiritual warfare, we must appreciate how the path of righteousness is not only the foundation of the way of holiness. My dear friends, we must also appreciate how the path of righteousness is the way of escape. By definition, the way of escape is the path you must follow to succeed your tests, trials, and spiritual warfare. On each occasion, Yahuwah will empower you to endure the situation until the appointed time, in which he brings the event to a conclusion, allowing you to escape. Now, I first introduced the way of escape in End Times 394, Reigning Over Disobedience and Doubt, Part 4, which was posted on December 27th, 2024. In that podcast, we analyze the helmet of salvation, i.e., the peace within, the whole armor of Elohim, which we unlock via our mastery of obedience. Along these lines, we found the helmet of salvation to be one of the most crucial pieces of our armor for 3 primary reasons, which I will offer as an inflection point. And if you didn't bookmark it then, I advise you to bookmark it now. The helmet of salvation is designed to A, guard your mind in spiritual warfare, B, communicate the battle strategy, and C, reveal the way of escape. Now, as it pertains to the way of escape, we understand that escape in this context is not equated to running away from the battle. Quite the contrary. Escape in this context is equated to evading the dangers of spiritual warfare. It is about resisting the temptation to deviate from the path of righteousness. It is about ignoring the distractions the enemy has situated adjacent to your path. Now, in case you don't see the grave danger in the enemy's efforts, allow me to share his strategy with you. Give me the time to show you how vital the way of escape is to your eternal future and why you are a dead man if you don't follow it. Consider this, my friends, and be advised. Satan's strategy in spiritual warfare is to attack you with a wide variety of assails to draw you away from the path of righteousness. He does this because he knows that if he can draw you away from this path, you will become defiled. Now, that was the inflection. Here is the danger. Vis-a-vis, defilement is aligned with the third phase in the progression of contempt. Enter separation. And if you don't think this is a grave danger, consider this. If the enemy can separate you from the Father and his goodwill, he can position himself to work his will in your life. And in case you didn't know it, the will of Satan is as deadly as it is simple. For lo, his will is to kill, to steal, and to destroy. Ergo, every time you ignore the way of escape and allow Satan to draw you away from the path of righteousness, you can expect, at minimum, one of 3 outcomes. death, thievery, or destruction. Now, this brings us to the question of the hour, vis-a-vis, how do you find the way of escape? Understanding how there is no path to victory in spiritual warfare without it, how do you find the way of escape? That is indeed the question, my friend, and I shall reveal the answer in the upcoming podcast. Yahuwah bless you until then. Now, here is the final word. You will never win a spiritual fight if you fail to do what's right. Brothers and sisters, hear me carefully as I say, this is not rocket science, and yet the enemy is pillaging our nation. Alas, he is having terrific success in spiritual warfare, even though the power we possess is greater than the power of darkness. Here lies the inflection, my friend. To wit, the power of the Ruach is not the issue. Quite the contrary. The issue is the fact that many within this nation don't know how to use it. And the primary reason why they don't know how to use it is because they are not committed to the path of righteousness. They are not committed to doing what they know is right. Now, let me tell you something. If you are not committed to following the path of righteousness, you will never be successful in spiritual warfare, for there is no other path to victory. As you learned in this podcast, this path is the way of escape. Heretofore, I recommend stay in the path of righteousness and resist the temptation to stray. For your sins will separate you from the Father, and your iniquities will carry you away. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on the word you have heard today. And as always, ask the Father to reveal the truth to you. For the children of Elohim live by conviction. And if he has not convicted you, or if you had not heard him concerning these matters, you should pray until you do. Today, I want you to meditate on the word I have shared. And I want you to prepare your mind and heart to receive what the Ruach has for you in the next podcast concerning the way of escape and the next step you must take to achieve heart regulation. And if you have the time, I advise you to listen to the 5 podcasts I mentioned in this lesson to refresh your memory to some crucial matters we'll be covering on Wednesday. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in 2 days. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 443, Reigning Over Contempt, Part 3. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 444, Reigning Over Contempt, Part 4. I will post this podcast on Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim. Continue to watch. Continue to pray. Continue in fasting. And most of all, continue to be focused. For the end is coming. The end is near.